Welcome back to the Building Bigger Lives podcast. Today is another fun book club episode, which we love to do. Today we're talking about the book Quiet by Susan Cain, and it goes through the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking. So that's what Michael Regan and I are going to discuss today. I'm Kathryn Peterson. Welcome back. And Michael, let's get this episode kicked off.
Yeah, I love your setup because you used the subtitle of the book, and that might be my favorite subtitle of any book I've ever read. Like the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking. What a beautiful choice. So kudos to the publisher on that one.
Yeah, I do like that. And I think it's important that it has the power of,
Mm.
because it's, as you read the book, you do realize introverts really do a lot of amazing things and really don't get a lot of the credit. So it'll be fun to break it down a little bit.
Excellent, excellent. Well, let's dive in.
All right. So who introduced you to this book and what was the story behind that?
All right, so I'm going to do my best to keep my story as I remember it. My mother, I believe, had a copy of this book and shared it with Lori, my wife. And I'm not sure what the setup was between the two of them, other than we had a copy of this book in our house maybe 8 years ago that Lori had brought home. And I decided to pick it up because I loved that subtitle. And because I had spent most of my life being labeled extroverted simply because I'm comfortable speaking in front of groups, I engage socially. I like to tell jokes. So, I certainly present as a person who's very comfortable with people. And therefore, the quick assumption, if you just get to know me quickly, is, oh, that guy's somewhere on the extroverted side of the scale. But I knew that my real story was I deeply value my time to be alone. And what people don't know when they see me in a public setting is I'm often looking for where are my spots where I can just go sit by myself for a few minutes or break away from the crowd. Use the strategic need to use the restroom play as frequently as possible. And I was curious about a book that might give me some clues as to what introversion really meant. And so I think I was intrigued as I saw it sitting on, Lori's stack of books. She's in a book club, I know, like you are. And it was just one of the books. It grabbed my attention, and I was really happy to dig into it.
Yeah, I'm similar to you, and there's a quiz at the beginning, which we all who grew up with the magazines with quizzes in it love quizzes, right? And I don't know if you did the quiz. If
Yeah.
you did, where did it put you on the scale?
So she describes a third category that I had never heard of before I had read the book. Most of us are pretty clear on extrovert and introvert, or at least we think we are. She did two things early on with this assessment. Was she defined the fact that none of us are 100% introverts or 100% extroverts, or they'd probably have to lock us up. Like that's not a category where any of us are 100. So it was a quick reminder of, okay, you're somewhere on a sliding scale. And if you landed somewhere in this nebulous space in the middle, she introduced a term called ambivert. And at first I thought that sounded silly until I looked it up and realized, oh no, that's actually a category in social science. And it in fact described my experience rather perfectly. And so the assessment right off the bat grabbed my, I mean, I was definitely going to read this book once I realized she was not only intriguing me with her subtitle, but then validating my experience with the assessment. So how about you? Where did you fall on the scale?
So it's funny, we did not talk about this ahead of time, but I am also an ambivert and also thought I was an extrovert. And it's because I hang out with a ton of introverts, like extreme introverts. So my sister took it and she was like at the extremely introverted side of the scale. And so I think because I hang out with so many introverts, I thought I was extroverted and I am in comparison, but I'm not an extrovert. So I'm also an ambivert. And one of the things I loved about how she described it was you love going to a coffee shop and sitting at a coffee shop, working or doing something, but you don't really want people to come up and talk to you. And I kind of liked that analogy, and I will seek out things like that where I can go and sit and be by myself, but have some activity maybe to watch or be around. So I think it's a really good thing to know where you sit on that scale, because I think a lot of us are wrong.
Yeah, that even as you described the coffee shop scenario. So as you know, and maybe some of our listeners know, Lori and I spend our summers in a little town in Oregon called Lake Oswego. Well, little by the standard of where we also live in Scottsdale. I guess by your town standards, we live in a thriving metropolis. But about 40,000 people here in Lake Oswego, and I think you just described my mindset. I love walking around in the village of our little downtown, knowing that I'm out with all kinds of people. It's very much like a resort town. In fact, I often describe it as a Colorado ski town without a mountain. It has that feel. But when I walk around, I can be with all of these people. I don't need to necessarily be engaged in anyone else's conversation, or I don't need to be, have anyone engage me. I just enjoy being in a social setting without necessarily having to talk a lot. And that was a real validation for me as well in this. So I'm glad you brought up the coffee shop example, because it is true. I'm also one of those people who's perfectly comfortable going to a movie by himself, because I can sit around all these people. We're all having a shared experience, but we're watching the movie. We don't really need to talk about it.
Right, absolutely. And I've been around those people who will literally walk up to anybody and start talking to them, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I wouldn't do that." And it makes you realize like, "Oh, that's an extrovert." So now it's making more sense to me. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know
yeah.
if I don't know if my good friend Dawn Boxberger will listen to this episode, but if she would, she's laughing right now because her goal when she boards a plane is to get the middle seat, because it allows her a double opportunity. So even if the person on the left isn't that interested, maybe the person on the right will be interested in striking up a conversation. And Lori and I just laugh and we think, gosh, the first thing we want to do is get some earbuds in. So it's sort of the social cue of I'm listening to something. Please don't bother me.
That's funny. That's funny. I have met some very interesting people on planes, so most likely they were an extrovert sitting in the
I'm
middle.
probably missing out. I'm sure I've sat next to wonderful people that I should have spent some time with.
Absolutely. Well, good. Well, let's talk about instead the people you're sitting next to on the plane and the people you care most about. So, how did the author help you understand the people in your life that
Mm.
may fit on her scale somewhere?
Okay, so it's funny. It is funny that we didn't really set this up. So, proof to our audience, these are not scripted episodes. We literally bring a topic to the table and we record. Kathryn, I think I too am surrounded by a lot of introverted people. So, Lori and I recognized early on that our kids could not handle Lori's energy level. She would tip a little bit on the extroverted side of the scale, not extreme, but probably like you described, probably shows more extroverted simply because of the heavy weight on the other side of the scale with our three kids. And her energy level would regularly be draining to our kids, and not in a way that they didn't love her. I mean, they love their mom. They are calling her as adults still on a regular basis. So it's not a lack of relationship. It's just they have to choose spots with her because Lori gets excited and Lori's energy pops up, and you can just feel their batteries starting to drain. I think when I read this book, I realized, oh my gosh, this could be a really great help for me as a parent of introverted children who are becoming adults. Because I want to affirm that in them. As you said, the way the book is written, it's a really positive view of the power of introverts. So I wanted to affirm in them that, hey, don't let the world tell you, that you're only valuable if you speak up more or if you do more. Like there's value in being introverted if you recognize the value. And so I wanted that too. I just wanted to be able to assure them that I know you. I know you at a deep level, not just because I've raised you, but because I'm paying attention to how you were uniquely made. And therefore, as you mature and grow, we can really value what that becomes. I know Bob Goff influenced you at one point in time, and I love that phrase:
Mm.
see people not for who they've been, but for who they're becoming. And so this book was a really great tool for me to see who my kids were becoming, and then to help them paint a vision of a future in which their introversion could really play to their strength if they saw it as an asset.
Yeah, I love that because it is a strength. And I think if you can recognize it in other people, you can maybe say, oh, they're super introverted, but I want their opinion. So, what's a good way to get that? Or what's a good way to make sure that they're comfortable speaking, even though it's going to be difficult for them?
So one of the phrases that I've learned is really helpful in lowering the barrier just a little bit with my more introverted relationships is a how question.
Mm.
Simple questions like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How was your weekend? How questions allow them to enter the conversation with a little bit less anxiety. And once that happens, often we find out, just like I found out in my introversion, we have lots of things we enjoy talking about as long as we feel welcomed into that conversation. If it feels like we have to, think of that pace of an introvert and an extrovert. It's kind of like if we're both driving cars, and if the introvert likes driving on a slow country road and the extrovert likes driving on the autobahn, like a really fast freeway, asking an introvert to join the extrovert conversation is like jumping into the fast lane, like going from 30 to 80, and it just feels like white knuckling the wheel. So
Yeah.
if you ask a how question, it allows them to enter that first lane and slowly work their way over into the second lane and into the third lane. And if they desire to, hang on there for a while, that's fine. Or they may start working back over to an exit ramp. But if
Mm.
you really value their perspective and you care about how they feel, I think you have to get really good at asking how questions.
Oh, that's a great analogy. And I'm going to use that because it is amazing how many introverted clients I have. And I think it's because I have so many in my life and you learn to kind of adjust your style to that a little bit. And how questions a really, really great tactic with that. And I am imagining the Autobahn and that would be scary. So I like the middle lane in the highway, and maybe that's why.
I'll let you know about the Autobahn after I get back from driving on it. I'll be doing that in a few weeks, and maybe that analogy will break down on me. But I'm actually very excited to see what this beautiful analogy actually looks like in real life.
Take a picture, please. So, why would understanding this topic or this book help out our audience?
So you've already given us a really great clue. So if our audience didn't pick up on it, I just want to remind them that all of us are surrounded by people along the scale of introversion to extroversion. And so you said I have a lot of clients who are introverted. I used the example of I have family members. You did as well. I think if we're willing to recognize that life is about the relationships we build and the influence we have rooted in the decisions we make. If we just think about that framework for a minute, that we don't have a lot of control over things economically or politically or religiously. These are all the topics people struggle with. If you want to get into a good argument, go on Facebook, pick any of those three topics, and you'll have a good old time. If you want to work through life in a context of how do we move forward with people that aren't always like us, I think the value of reading a book like this is it becomes a bit of an answer key. It starts to give you not just clues as to what this might look like, but really positive attributes. So, for example, I loved her story of Dr. Martin Luther King. So, here's a historical figure, a prominent figure that I think by now most people universally, like you could go into Europe and people know who Dr. Martin Luther King is. He's not just an American figure. I think he's really a character that most of us have embraced as a major influencer in the lifetime that we've grown up in. Well, if you look at his story, it's easy to see all of the wonderful things he did as an orator. You know, a person who was comfortable standing in front of the podium and really delivering powerful messages that reshaped the thinking of a lot of people that got to hear him. What we got to see in her story was the power of an introvert like Rosa Parks, someone
Mhm.
who quite quietly refused to give up her seat on the bus as a matter of principle because she was not going to be told where to sit on a public bus. And the consequences of that were very real. She knew that. She knew exactly what could happen to her. And so the storylines that were paralleled there were these were two people that had significant impact on the future of the way that we in America managed attention that had existed prior to that for hundreds of years. These two people really were major players in the shift. They both did it with completely different styles. One very outspoken and bold, one very quiet and bold. And I think when you look at stories like that, I think back to your question of why read the book, it really helps to see that for every Steve Jobs in the world, there was a Steve Wozniak behind the scene actually building the computer that was going to be used and sold by a guy like Steve Jobs. So it takes both, is the storyline I pulled out of the book. And to simply ignore that or refuse to acknowledge that really limits, I think, our ability to value the current introverts that are around us and the amazing contribution they can make to our world.
And one thing I think is important is what are some hints to you to identify if someone is an extrovert, an introvert, and an ambivert? And I'll be curious if your answer is the same as mine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this one comes up quite a bit in conversations in our vernacular because I think the mistake we made prior to reading the book was we tended to think it was all about people. So the more you love spending time with people, the more we assumed, oh, you're extroverted. The less you like spending time with people, you're more introverted. And the book did a great job of dismantling that you're using the wrong scale. Like that's not the scale of introversion, extroversion, or that space in between called ambiversion. It's really about energy. And it's about where energy is either depleted or replenished based on the interaction with people. So people by themselves don't determine. Lots of introverts love spending time with people. They just have to be careful because if that's going to drain their batteries, they've got to find a way to recharge. Extroverts, on the flip side, get recharged by being with people, not being by themselves. So think
Mhm.
about our friend, let's flip the story over because the book was written way before an event called COVID that we all had to deal with here now 3 or 4 years ago now. Our extroverted friends really suffered during a stay-at-home season because they didn't have a natural way to recharge their batteries by getting out and being with people. Yeah, our introverted friends were probably thrilled. They thought, well, finally, the world is making sense to me. Like this is the way we love to operate. Um, and so I want to acknowledge that I think energy is the way we pick up on those clues. So if I see someone whose energy level is increasing in a public setting, I'll tend to recognize they're somewhere on the extroverted side. If their energy is depleting, they're somewhere on the introverted side. And if I see them kind of staying, as you might guess from an ambivert, somewhere in the middle, meaning their energy doesn't seem to be going up or down, but they're not disappearing on us. They're hanging in there. They're probably somewhere in that ambivert scale, if you would. And and it helps me then adjust the way in which I engage with them so that I'm not intentionally draining their batteries.
And sometimes I just ask, like, hey, are you extroverted or introverted? Or you seem like you're fairly introverted. Is that true? Am I picking up on that correctly? Because then I can have a conversation around how that changes how they operate in their life and their business, because I think it's a really kind of fun conversation to have with clients and referral partners and things like that of, hey, how do you bring that side to your business? Because I do think it's an important piece that we don't always talk about, but it's so fascinating to learn about people.
So as you do that, do you ever find that people's answer is based on our earlier assumption that they think they're introverted for reasons that they may not fully understand what introversion is, or they think they're extroverted for reasons that they may not fully understand? Or do you ever get into that layer of the discussion once you've asked that question?
So I bring up the book, and that just helps. But I think that people overall, other than the ambivert piece, which is such a newer term once you pick up on the book, I think a lot of people, at least the introverts, normally know that they're introverted, right? But I think there's this stigma that it can be bad to be an introvert, especially if you're in a sales job or a job that requires a lot of being around people. So that's, I think, why it's an interesting topic to cover, because people then, if they're willing to talk about it, it's something that is kind of, well, will connect you more deeply. But yeah, I think there's definitely people who have a misinterpretation, like both you and I did, that, hey, we're extroverted. No, we aren't. So it does help, but I always bring up that quiz too to say, hey, pick up the
That's
book
great.
and let me know what you think.
Yeah, that's great. I, of course, am thinking of a good friend of both of ours who is a very, very highly productive producer in the housing industry, specifically in mortgage, but she is extremely introverted. And it was surprising to many around her to find, wow, how are you able to be so successful in a business that requires you to be so engaged with people? And she just has learned to be really careful about how she picks her spots and where she recharges her batteries. So lots of hiking alone, lots of walking her dog, lots of, think biking. These are all things that give her that energy replenishment so that she can go out and do it. But you're absolutely right. It kind of blows a hole in the theory that, well, you can't be a successful sales leader if you're introverted. And so if you're listening out there and anyone's ever told you that, A, it's a lie. And B, like Kathryn just said, maybe go pick up the book Quiet by Susan Cain and see if it encourages you in a way as it did us. And so, Kathryn, one more question for you. If I said, you went at some point, you said you referenced this book quite a bit. You went from interested in it as a reader to someone who's now sharing it with others. What's that experience been like? Have you had any feedback from someone after they've taken you up on the offer? They've ordered it from Amazon or downloaded it in their Audible and they've enjoyed it. Have they given you some feedback after they've experienced what we did?
I think that everyone that has read it that I've talked to loves it because it does give a different insight that you aren't expecting. And it's easy to read, it's comfortable to read. And I think whenever a book introduces you to something that you aren't expecting, it makes it fun and interesting
Hmm.
to read and engaging. So everyone I've talked to about it has loved it and kind of like me that they see a different perspective on things. What about you? What do people think?
Yeah, one of them comes to mind, and I've this is probably one of the top three books I've shared. So I've given it out a lot. I've had a lot of feedback from people, just like you described. One that really stands out to me is a friend of mine came to visit Portland from Scottsdale. I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, and we went out and did some of the classic Portland things, and we ended up at Powell's Books, which is Powell's City of Books, is a legendary bookstore here in the city of Portland. And as we went in, there was I don't know, a feature shelf with some books that maybe were recommended, and Quiet was there. I picked it up and just showed it to him and said, "Oh my gosh, this is one of my favorite books to share." And he said, "What is it?" He read the subtitle, and I immediately said, "I'll buy you a copy if you'll promise me you'll read it." And he's like, "I don't mind buying the book." I said, "No, no, seriously, I'd love to buy it for you. But I think if you read it, you'll find it powerful." He called me back a week, 10 days later, whenever he had finished it, and said, "You didn't know this, but that book really helped me understand my daughter. And that really helped me change how she and I can interact because now I understand where the strength is in her style and I'm able to speak to it." So that meant a lot to me to know that I was able to help a guy who, as a friend, I love, and I love his daughter, who's she's a mom. This is not like a little girl.
Mhm.
Like he was able to really develop a great relationship with his adult daughter simply because we referred that book to him.
Yeah, I think that if you're an extrovert or an introvert or an ambivert, it's a good book to pick up because you can help understand those people around you. And even if it, I feel like it helped me understand extroverts more and understand the role that they play. So I think it was actually shows you the whole landscape of it and where people fit in together and how they connect together and how we need all those types.
Well
Extroverts
said.
may get the spotlight more, so it was good that she really spotlighted the introverts,
Yeah.
but I think that it's a great read no matter where you fit on the spectrum.
Yeah, I think you nailed that description well, and I like your use of the term landscape because I think that's a very fair description of what we deal with. If you recognize in the world how many people we interact with to get things done, your ability to understand where people are coming from really does help you accelerate and do more. And so, yeah, I guess if you don't care about personal growth, you don't care about professional growth, and you don't care about, doing things, yeah, you probably aren't listening to building bigger lives if that's the case. But if that's where you're stuck, then of course, learning about folks with other styles won't be as compelling. But I think most of us that are tuned into this podcast understand that we're looking for ways to expand our capacity to get the most out of life. And this one, I think, is a really low hanging fruit. You can really grab onto this quite easily. And just a few days after reading it, it can really change the way you interact with all kinds of people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, any other closing comments or thoughts on the book that you don't feel like we have covered yet?
Yeah, I would simply say that should you read it, should it impact you, and should you feel that's a lot of shoulding I just did. So forgive me for that. I proof once again that we're not, pre-scripting this. I I think if it impacts you in such a way to where you have those moments, my encouragement would be go connect with people that you recognize when you're reading it. So maybe even, if you're in the habit of journaling, maybe make a note of, oh my gosh, I think that's my aunt. Oh my gosh, that's my processor. Oh my gosh, that's the client that I'm working with. So that as you do, rather than, somehow jumping straight to, hey, I just read a book, you should read this, that might be a little bit of a difficult transition for someone. They may feel like, are you psychoanalyzing me? Like, what is going on? Maybe just give them an acknowledgement of, I was learning something recently. It made me think of you and really appreciate something about you that I don't know that I've ever told you before. And I just want to let you know, like, why I appreciate this so much. If you can do that, you draw someone in and they might be interested, whether they're extroverted, ambiverted, or introverted. I think if you recognize people and you show appreciation, it's only natural that they might want to say, "Wow, what made you think of that?" Or "Where that's interesting. You're right about that, but what brought that up?" And maybe the book then becomes a more natural referral, because I think most of us, just wanna be ourselves, and it's nice when people really recognize us for who we really are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why the book has done so well because it comes off in a way that is accepting of all the types and it gives people some good thoughts around that and it's never done in a judgmental way. So I think it's a great book to pass on to people and I bring it up a lot. A lot, a lot. When we were trying to figure out what book to cover, I can't even remember how we got to this one, but we were both like, "Oh yes, that's a great book. Let's be sure to talk about that book."
Well, I'm pretty sure it's for the same reason that what we both referenced earlier. When it's a book that, 8 to 10 years after we read it is still such a strong referral. We still tell people about it. We still reference it. I mean, for those of you watching on video, I'm standing with bookshelves on either side of me. I mean, like Kathryn said, we both love reading, and reading has been a huge part of the way I've expanded my thinking as an adult. But some books just pass. You read them and they were okay, and you maybe don't think about them again. Other books, you start referencing them over and over again. And so hearing you say that probably got me excited, because I thought, hey, me too. I do the same thing. And so I hope our audience feels that same energy of, look, if you're looking for a book that can open an answer key to a relationship in your life, whether personally or professionally, there's no doubt in my mind, to Kathryn's point, whether you come from one side of the scale or the other, or somewhere in between, you'll recognize yourself, you'll recognize others, and you will hopefully be encouraged to try some new things that help build a bridge to grow a relationship, because you have a new perspective.
That was a good way to summarize it. All right. So with that, we're going to close this episode out. This was a book club episode of Building Bigger Lives. Thanks so much for joining us. We'd love to have you here. Please keep passing this on to your friends who you think might be interested in this topic. Check out our episodes on Apple. Find us also on YouTube and Instagram. Thank you so much for being here. This closes out another episode.